In this lecture, as outlined in your notebook, we have three main parts. We're going to look at the wing's components, those elements from which it's made. We're going to look at the aerodynamics, how it flies, and finally, and most importantly, we're going to look at the modes, the various angles of attack at which we fly the glider. In the notebook, there are three charts, the one dealing with components, the one dealing with the modes, and then there's a third chart which we're not going to talk much about. It's to help you select the glider when that day comes. Let's look at the components chart. We've got 5 main areas here to talk about, and the surprising thing about hang gliders is that they're way stronger than most people think. And the main purpose of looking at this is to see that these are not rag wings. These are not flimsy things that are going to fall apart in a bit of a breeze. And even paragliders have a huge safety factor compared to what people think, although they're not quite as extra strong as hang gliders are. If we look at down the left side, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's here and it's really not that important. You're never going to be designing your own wing or building your own wing, at least I hope not, without a really good expertise. But as we go down, maybe I'll just touch on a few of the key components. The sail, for example, that rag wing that we sometimes have people refer to it, is 300 times stronger than it needs to be. So looking across the top of the chart, you see we've got the part, the sail, what it's made of, the material, and you'll see a couple of different types, and then a tongue-in-cheek PVC plastic. Believe it or not, when I started flying, there were people who flew plastic wings. Not very high. Their adage was, never fly higher than you're afraid to fall. Regular sailcloth is extremely strong. Do we need something that's 300 times stronger than, the load on it? No, we don't. The reason that we need a stiff sail is so that it will hold its shape between ribs. So that's leads us to the particulars for the pre-flight inspection, which is something that we do every time we fly. That's really the only thing in these charts that's done every time. The other charts, the wind chart, the Windividual, you should score those charts every time you fly. Now, that will become automatic shortly, so it's not like you have to sit down with the paper. But those things you think about every time. These things, the only part you think about every time is the pre-flight. And then a replacement time. And the replacement time, you can see 250 hours of flying or 1,200 hours of exposure to sunlight. Now that's a worst case scenario. If you're thinking about regular use in our northern climates, it would probably be double that. Going on down, you see that the fastenings are aircraft grade. They're stainless steel. They're really tough. The only thing you have to be sure is that they're done up. Then we've got the hardware, all the fastening points, the parts that hold the nose together and so on, the corner brackets on the control bar. And these are also made of high-grade aluminum or stainless steel. When we come to the rigging, there's something here that probably I should draw your attention to. You can see the material. It says it's 3/32. That's its diameter, and there are some cables on gliders that are even more so, or even bigger. Like the side wires on a large glider might be 1/8 inch. But most of them are 3/32. Then it says 7x7. And then it says galvanized. Well, again, that's ancient history. They would all be stainless steel now. Very, very rare we would see a galvanized wire. And if it was, it would be low reliability because it could corrode. But something you should be aware of. What 7x7 means is that there are 7 bundles of 7 strands in each bundle. So suppose we broke one strand. How much strength would you think you'd lose? I mean,
Very little.
You'd think very little. You'd think 1/49th. maybe 2%. In actual fact, when you lose one strand, you lose the bundle. So you lose more like 15%. So any kind of a fray or nasty kink or anything that you're suspicious on your flying wires, the wires beneath the glider, don't fly until you replace it. The tubing here, again, most tubing is aircraft grade aluminum, or some of it's 6061, which is an aircraft notation construction grade of tubing. It has the lowest of the safety factors. You see 10 to 15. And that depends on which tube. Of course, the various tubes on your glider some are more important than others. The crossbar is kind of important, so you really want to check that one meticulously. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that some people are concerned about a broken down tube and think, well, maybe I'll just put a little bit beefier down tube on my glider, and that way I won't have to worry about replacing a down tube if I have a little whack. Sounds like a good idea. It's a bad idea. Why? Because the tubing is there partly to protect you. If you whack and your shoulder hits a down tube, which would you prefer to break? A $30 down tube or a $300, $3,000, maybe more dollar shoulder, never mind the pain and suffering. So that tubing is made to break in that situation. So you don't want to beef up your tubing on the down tubes. And of course, we wouldn't want to change the amount of flex that the tube has if we were going to replace any components on the glider airframe in the actual wing. We'd want to make sure we use manufacturer's proper tubing. You don't want to put the wrong size in there. It might flex differently, might put a big turn in the glider or whatever. Basically, these gliders are tanks. They're 6 to 10 times stronger than most light aircraft. You actually got a higher safety factor flying in your hang glider than you do driving in a car or flying in a regular commercial aircraft by a long stretch. So be relaxed. Don't look in your notebooks. There's nothing in the notebook on aerodynamics. It's not something you really need to know about. It's a nice to know kind of thing. Much like in driving a car, you don't have to know how the engine works. You're probably a little bit more reliable driver if you do understand how an internal combustion engine works, or whatever engine you're driving. So let's just look at a couple. I've got a kind of a fun way to look at aerodynamics without talking too much about drag in the beginning. We'll leave that to the end. So there are two basic things that act on a wing to give it lift. Can you think what they might be?
Forward movement and wind.
Exactly. You've got it in that one part of it, the shape lift, is aerodynamic. And basically what happens in aerodynamic lift is, if we use this model, the wing moves through the air. If it's at the right angle of attack, then that air flows over the upper surface and it lifts. It actually causes a bit of a vacuum and lifts from above the wing. It sucks the wing up. You'll see here we've got the shape lift lifting, and it happens at about 1/3 the chord. So the chord is from the front to the back of the wing. So about 1/3 back is where that acts. Now there's another thing, size. Because hang gliders fly at a much higher angle of attack than regular aircraft, and I mean, if you think about a Cessna, it stalls at 17 degrees. We stall at up around 40 degrees on the lower aspect ratio gliders. So we fly at a much higher angle of attack, and a way to demonstrate this is with a piece of paper. If you take a piece of paper and you put a curve in it and you run air over the top of it, you see how it lifts? So that's, which kind of lift? Shape. Because it goes over the curved surface and sucks the wing up. The other comes from beneath the wing and is just a function of the area. It's sort of, maybe you call it parachute lift. If you drop the paper like that, it goes down pretty slowly. But if you put it at no angle of attack, it drops very quickly. So that's a function of size. And the size lift just simply comes from the center of area. And we see it here. Now the two combine to form the average lift, and we call that the center of lift. And when we balance a hang glider, we hang the pilot right underneath that, and that's called the center of gravity, or the CG. So that's a balanced wing, and everything looks good. Now, let's look at two very different scenarios. Let's first of all exaggerate the angle of attack, raise the nose dramatically. Now, what happens to an aircraft when you raise the nose? I just talked about the phenomenon. As you raise the nose on the glider,
You start to stall.
you start to stall, which basically, by definition, means you're losing your shape lift. Now, on a hang glider, because the tips are washed out, because the center of the glider is at a very different angle than the tips of the glider, that's called washout. That twist in the wing means that the tips are already at a lower angle. So they actually don't stall. So you're still getting a little bit of lift back here from shape. But most of it we lose because the wing has stalled. What happens to our size lift? Well, we've increased the amount of area that the relative wind sees, so it'll increase. So we see that although it stays in the same place because it just comes from the center of area, it's bigger now. So look what happens as we raise the angle of attack, raise the nose. The center of lift diminishes a little bit and moves back. So what would be the tendency of that situation? That's not balanced.
You would go slowly down?
You're going to go down, and what's going to happen to the angle on the glider when the CG is in front of the center of lift? It's going to want to pitch down and recover. So, and you'll feel this when you're flying. When you're flying that hang glider and you push out and to raise the nose and it starts to stall, it will want to drop its nose. And you can see that to actually hold it in a stalled position, you'd have to move your weight way back, and it's very hard to hold it there. So that would be holding it in a stall, or in this case, maybe a partial stall because the tips are still flying a little bit. And that's why a hang glider is so stable. It's very resistant to any kind of a spin. A spin on an aircraft is when you stall one wing and then the other wing flies around the stalled wing. But we don't usually stall a tip because those tips are at a lower angle of attack. So that's the scenario with a high angle of attack. The nose wants to drop all on its own. If not, we've got to really hold our weight back. Let's look at the reverse. Now we've exaggerated a low angle of attack. We've dropped the nose. The angle of attack is much less. Actually, it could be down to about 10 degrees, but I wouldn't have room for any writing. And now what happens? Well, what happens to our shape lift? More airflow. So we're going to get more shape lift. And what about at the tips? The tips were already at a low angle of attack. Now we're lowering the nose even more. The air is actually going to hit on the top of the tips and push down. We're actually going to get some negative size lift out at the tips because of the washout. And also, because of that, we're not going to get very much lift out there. So the aerodynamic or shape lift is going to move forward, and we're losing that lift at the edges. So although it's increased in the center of the wing, it's decreased at the tips. And so the resultant center of lift will be quite a bit moved forward. So now what's the desire of the glider? The center of lift or center of pressure is in front of the center of gravity. So this is down, this is up. It's going to tend to lift its nose all by itself, or to hold it in a dive or at high speed, you have to work at it. Now this is on a regular standard hang glider. As we get to more advanced gliders, we'll talk about that, but you can actually pull on a VG and change the shape of the glider so that it's more aerodynamic at high speeds. We're not going to worry about that in this beginner session. If we raise the nose of the glider by pushing out, we let go, the glider returns to what we call trim speed. If we pull in, let go, glider returns to trim speed. So basically it's got kind of like an automatic cruise control that flies at the angle of attack that it's happy. And that's perfect. That's why we can fly with a lovely light touch. If you're ever wondering, if you think your glider's not performing well, it's difficult to turn, whatever, just relax, let the glider go to trim, probably it'll fix it. Let's go now to the modes chart. And this is really the heart of this lecture, and it's a lot of information packed into a very small space. So we're going to take our time and go through, and remember that it's fine to review, go back and look over it again. But let's first of all go through the titles of each column and make sure we understand the meanings of these words. And there are different things that other people may use to describe the same thing. It doesn't really matter the language you use. What matters is that you understand the concepts. And again, it's the wing. It flies by itself. You don't really have to understand it either. So the first thing are the modes. A stall. We talked about a stall. What's a stall mean? We've lost our shape lift. Let's go then to C, minimum sink. Now what minimum sink is it's the highest angle of attack where no part of the wing is stalled. So that means that if you slow down from minimum sink, what's going to happen?
It's going to try to get back to...
Firstly, it'll try to recover, and secondly, some part of the wing is stalling. Which part?
The shape lift.
The shape lift at the center or root of the glider, because the tips resist the stall.
Yes.
So the center of the glider will start to stall. And when part of the wing is flying and part of the wing is stalled, that's mush. So mush is really stall also. Mm-hmm. It's just a degree of stall. And if you look down in the bottom, you'll see how large that area of mush is. If you see that at C, okay, from a 100-foot hill or 100-foot height, we would go in mode C, minimum sink, we'd go 700 feet forward. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. And B is that whole gray area between C and A, which is what we're calling a full stall. But in fact, probably we wouldn't be able to stall the glider entirely. There'd still be a little bit of tip flying. But to all intents and purposes is that point where the glider really wants to break and drop its nose. That's the full stall. Then as we lower the angle of attack a little bit more, we get to max glide. That's trim. That's where most gliders are trimmed. And by the way, if you wanted to change the trim on the glider, how would you do that? Let's say you wanted to trim the glider a little bit faster or a little bit slower.
You'd move your body weight.
You'd move the hang point, which is where you hang from, a little bit further forward or a little bit further back. And I say a little bit because you don't want to mess with more than 3/4 an inch at the most. So that's max glide. Now we've got a D asterisk. All right. Now that is min sink plus 5 miles an hour. So that's a little bit lower, a little bit faster speed, a little bit lower angle of attack. And then finally E, dive. Now dives with the bar pulled right to your knees as far forward as you can pull your body. And you can see that if you go down to line 4, that the angle of attack is still 10 degrees. Mm-hmm. So we can't ever get the angle of attack to 0. We just can't physically do it. So now let's go down the left side and look at the various lines and see if we can understand how this all works and the interrelationship between these various factors. First of all, line 1 is glide ratio. It says then path if wind equals 0. I'm distinguishing two terms here. One is glide path. Glide path is where the glider actually goes on a given day in the real world. That's the path the glider takes in the air. Glide ratio is the sort of academic number that would occur, should occur, if there was absolutely no wind. A pretty hard situation to get, maybe first thing in the morning on a perfect day. Even then, there's probably a little bit of air moving. But that's sort of what's calculated to be the ratio. And it, interestingly, a lot of people call that the L over D, the lift over drag. We're going to talk about drag in a minute, as I said. We've talked about lift. But really, I like the term glide path and glide ratio to distinguish between them. Lots of people talk about what's your L over D. What they really mean is what's your max L over D? What's your D? All right, what's your max glide? And on this glider, we're saying this is sort of a standard middle of the road beginner glider like a Falcon from Will's Wing. It's 8-to-1 glide, maybe a little bit more now with the most recent model. But it doesn't really matter what the numbers are. It's more the relationship that we're interested in here. Then we have an A and a B, two lines underneath. A is glide path in a 10-mile-an-hour headwind. Now, that would be a pretty normal situation for us to be flying in about a 10-mile-an-hour wind. 5 to 10 miles an hour would be an ideal wind to make the landings easy and takeoffs easy for a beginner. So what happens to the glide path as we get a headwind?
Decreases.
Why?
More resistance.
There's a wind blowing us back. A lot of people have difficulty understanding that. Some people think, well, if I'm flying into the wind's blowing at me, I'm going to get more lift because the air is coming at me. Well, actually, the glider has no idea whether there's any wind blowing. And the way to understand that most easily is to look at this situation. Let's look at the glide ratio if we increased the speed of the wind dramatically. So if we look down to air speed, which is line 5, okay, you can see that at trim, at max glide, the glider flies at 24 miles an hour. Well, let's just round it off and say it's 25. So we're flying at the glider's flying at 25 miles an hour. It has no idea what the wind speed is. Now, let's say we're flying in a 25 mile an hour wind. Okay, the glider's going 25 miles an hour this way. The wind is going 25 miles an hour this way. What's our glide path? Straight down.
Straight down, yeah.
We're not going anywhere. We're going 0 miles an hour over the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, that's called our ground speed.
Yeah.
So our airspeed is still 25, but because the wind speed is 25, they cancel each other out. We're going to come straight
Would you
down.
come down?
Sure.
Yeah.
You're thinking you'd get more lift because of the wind, but it actually you don't.
Okay.
You won't stay up. The glider sink rate would be whatever it is. The only way that a glider can go up is if the air it's in is going up faster than it's coming down. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
So that's in a 10-mile-an-hour headwind. So you can see, and in fact, in any amount of headwind, in order to get your best distance over the ground, your best glide path, you're going to need to increase your speed. And what I've suggested is, okay, we're going to say a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, we're going to increase our speed by 5 miles an hour. Oh, that's D prime, that's D asterisk line, D plus 5, right? So you can see that if you look down in the little cutout in the bottom of the diagram, you'll see that at D in a 10-mile-an-hour wind, see that, as per line 1A, 10-mile-an-hour wind, we only go 500 feet. But if we pull on 10 miles an hour of speed, we actually go 100 feet further. And in fact, any time that there's a headwind, in order to get the best distance over the ground, you're going to have to pull in by some amount. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then, just for fun, let's look at the situation where we turn around, and now we're going to fly the glider downwind. We're going to fly with the wind behind us. Now, does the airspeed change? Now we're flying with the wind. What determines the airspeed?
Airspeed is determined by the glide ratio. No.
By the angle of attack.
Okay.
And then the resultant, the glide ratio is something that, well, you could think of this too. You could think, okay, the glide ratio is the glide relative to the air. But of course, the air is invisible.
Yeah.
So in a 25-mile-an-hour wind, you're still gliding at 8 to 1.
Yeah.
However, the wind you're in is moving back at the same speed, so you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
But you can almost think of it as if the glider is flying in a little box, and it's flying the same all the time. But the little box is being blown around by the wind.
Yeah.
That's another way to imagine it. So in actual fact, when we turn downwind, our angle of attack is still the same. We're still flying the same speed, airspeed. But over the ground,
You're going quicker.
we're going to be going a lot quicker. We're going to add 25 miles an hour instead of subtracting.
Yeah.
So if we were flying 25, we'd be going 50 miles an hour over the ground.
Yeah.
When we're going downwind. And of course, we go a heck of a lot further.
Yeah.
If you look at this, what happens when you turn downwind in a 10-mile-an-hour tailwind, so, just 10 miles an hour behind us, it actually shows that it's not really very different whether we fly min-sync, max glide, or max glide asterisk. Max glide asterisk, we're D plus 5. We're going a little bit less distance, but not much. However, if we were to increase the wind more, then we would actually get to a point where we would actually go further if we slowed down a little bit, because it keeps us in the air longer and allows us to use that tailwind component to go further. It's still something we wouldn't do. You're not going to slow down, especially near the ground, in a strong tailwind. What if you stalled downwind and lost control and weren't able to turn back to land? It would be a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's glide ratio and glide path. So to summarize, what's the only time that glide ratio and glide path are theoretically the same?
Zero wind.
Exactly. If there's no wind, then they should be the same. Sync rate is a time function. It relates to how long it takes us to get to the ground from the 100 feet. So in this case, it's showing us, and we really don't have to pay any attention to stall and mush. It's max glide and min sync, and occasionally, max glide plus 5 that we're playing with here. At our regular glide, our max glide, our trim speed, we sink at about 250 feet a minute. Again, the numbers don't matter. It's just a comparison. But at min sync, 225. So we come down a little bit slower. So wait a minute. If we're coming down more slowly, wouldn't we end up going further?
I think so.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But what's the difference? Well, the difference is that at max glide, right, we're going 25 miles an hour, and we're going 8 to 1. At min sync, okay, a little bit higher angle of attack, we're only going 700 feet, and we're staying in the air longer. So we're coming down like that. So what happens is, this glider flying more slowly, okay, lands short. It lands after this glider, but because that glider is going faster, it gets to the ground first, but further. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So again, we wouldn't use min sync near the ground. And if you look down in the bottom under line 9 under uses, we can see that min sync, about the only time we use that is in thermal lift above 100 feet. Under 100 feet, we don't want to be slowing the glider down below trim speed. If anything, we want to be speeding up a little bit. Okay, so that's sync rate. And sync rate and time in the air are really the same thing. Because how do you calculate sync rate? Well, if you're trying to figure out You know the glider was at 100 feet, say it was a hill. How long does it take to get to the ground? You do your math. How many seconds it took to the ground. Now that'll tell you how many feet per second it's falling, okay? Or feet, in this case, feet per minute. Or whatever components you wish to use. It's funny that in aviation in North America, we're still using feet. We've transferred in Canada to Celsius, but we're still using feet. We're using meters and liters, but we're still using feet in aviation. So time in the air and sink rate are really the same thing. Similarly, angle of attack and airspeed are also sort of inseparably linked. You could almost put a little line between those two lines to link them together, because how do you adjust your airspeed? How would you lower the angle of attack to make it go faster? You raise the angle of attack, and how do you raise and lower the angle of attack? By moving your body. So airspeed is something that is a result of angle of attack. So those two, again, are a pair. And you can see, if you look at the airspeed, now that we have this one to look at, it's about 3 miles an hour faster at max glide than at min sync. Not a huge difference. I mean, look at the difference in angle of attack. It's only 5 degrees. Well, 5 degrees angle of attack is, you can barely see it. But you can feel it, right? Because if you slow the glider down from trim a little bit. Yeah. Then the next line to look at to see if we can understand this one is potential G load. I stress the potential. The G load is the amount of force on the glider. And the potential G load would only be realized if you were in extreme situations. For example, you flew really fast and then stuffed the bar. Okay, you can imagine that if you were going really fast and then stuffed the bar out, there's going to be more force on the glider as it carves a quick turn, and the pilot's going to pull harder on the airframe. There's going to be more force. The other thing would be hitting turbulence. Violent turbulence while you're flying really fast would achieve that potential G load. Kind of analogous to driving your car. If you're driving on a smooth road at 100 miles an hour, you don't really notice the speed. Everything's nice and smooth. But then let's suppose you hit some bumps in the road. Well, you're going to notice the difference if you're going fast compared to if you're going slow. If you want to really exaggerate, think about being in Mexico or somewhere like that where they have speed bumps in the road. Topos. Oh my gosh. It can feel like you hit a landmine if you hit them hard. That potential G load at slow speeds, there's not much. And then gradually, as you increase your speed, when you get to E, a full dive, all right, you're at
8. Is that
8?
times?
Now that's 8 times, 8 times. So if you, and the G load on the glider, let's say you weigh 150 pounds and the glider weighs 50 pounds, just to make it simple, it's a 200-pound load. That means you would be exposing the glider to 1,600 pounds. So you can see that even then, even though the gliders are stressed to 6 Gs positive and 4 Gs negative, so they're not as strong upside down, because you can't get a hang glider upside down by accident unless you're flying in really extreme air. And you're not going to be flying in really extreme air. We're going to avoid that by doing our wind charter reliability and stay out of that big lift. And if we get into the big lift, we're going to leave it early. Okay, so this is just to say, what speed should you fly in turbulence? Well, if you look simply at the potential G load line, you're going to think, well, I should stall. Right? I'll stall, then I'm only exposing my glider to 1 G. What's the problem with stalling if you're in bumpy air?
Loss of control.
Firstly, you're going to lose control, and secondly, you're going to be sitting in that turbulence for an extended period of time. So what you want to do to increase your control and authority and get out of there is increase, D plus 5. So go a little bit faster, or maybe even pull in 2 or 3 inches, but don't pull the bar to your knees. Get out of there and then relax. In violent air, in big air, big thermals, that's one of the only times that we hold on with a hard grip. We don't want to lose the bar in those situations. Number 7, line control, that's pretty well self-evident, and our best control is at trim speed, right around max glide. In aircraft, they sometimes call that best maneuvering speed. So your glider handles really well there. It still handles really well, a little bit faster and a little bit slower, but as you start to go really fast or really slow down, then your handling drops away off. And then percentage lift, size to shape. And I just throw this in because that ties it into the aerodynamics that we talked about earlier. And size and shape, there's always this interplay. So this is going to show us how much shape, how much size at each of our key modes or angles of attack. So at stall, we've lost most of our shape lift, right? However, we've increased our size lift. We're now mostly a parachute, not a paraglider. We don't turn into a parachute. In a paraglider, the wing will collapse. Now, why has it got 5%? Why isn't the wing totally stalled?
Because of the tail, the tips.
The tips, the washout. What a great set of tips on those gliders. In mush, well, of course, mush is a very broad range, so we're just going to say, okay, 50-50. But it's a little bit more as we get closer to sea, and it's a little bit less as we get back the other way in terms of how much shape lift we're getting. But when we get to minimum sink, we're still getting about 30% of our lift from beneath the wing, from angle of attack lift or downwash, or what we call it, size lift. And then at max glide, 80-20. Again, this is very different than most aircraft. A Cessna stalls at 17 degrees. We stall at 45 degrees, it says here. The range of angles of attack that a Cessna has to play with is very different. And the amount of washout in a Cessna, because they fly at, or any aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft, because they fly at so much higher speeds, they can't afford that much washout. It would be too much drag in their cruise. Be a lot more stable, but it wouldn't be practical. And then we start to go the other way. We start to lose even more of our size lift as we get down to 15% at prime plus. And then finally, at the lowest angle of attack, we're only getting 5% size lift because we've lowered that angle of attack to 10 degrees, and in fact, you're even getting a little negative size lift on the tips to pull us out of that dive. And probably the most important line, what do we use these things for? A stall is really only used either on landing, and you don't really need to do a full stall on landing. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other thing is if you were ever going to hit anything. If you were going to hit a tree or a building, another glider, well, if you were going to hit another glider, you're flying along, you see another glider, you think, oh my gosh, we're on a collision path. Would you stall your glider so that you would hit it with less force?
No, I'd avoid it.
No, you want to try to avoid the other glider, so you're going to turn right. The rule of aviation is turn right. So we both try to turn right to avoid each other, and that way there's no questions. But other than that, if you were going to hit something, you'd try to hit it slowly. Now, I said on landing, you don't need to do a full stall. And you've done enough training with us now to realize that what we like is the fearless, flareless, flawless landing. And what that means is we're going to slow down gently and run the landing out and continue to flare and continue to slow down, run the landing out, and not finish with that hard. Because the danger of mistiming that and coming in hard or going up 10 or 15 feet and then beaking, we're not interested in risking that. So you don't have to do a full stall. You can land in the mush mode and just take a few steps. So mush, well, it says we could use it for losing altitude above 50 feet, maybe above 100 feet. But that's only on a single surface glider, and use that with caution. We're going to get into a diagram in a minute here to talk about putting wind in this situation and see a situation where we might use mush. But the idea being that if you slow the glider down to mush and there's a bit of a headwind, you could drop vertically and then pick up your speed when you land if you felt like you were going to overshoot your desired landing area. The next one is min sync, and I said min sync, we're going to use that in thermal lift. I mean, the idea is that when would it make that big a difference? This 25 feet per minute that we're going to gain by slowing down a little bit.
You stay in the thermal longer.
Firstly, it slows us down. When we're in a thermal, it may not be that huge. So it slows us down a little bit.
And keep us in there.
So we can stay in there a little bit. And the other thing is, like, what if the thermal's rising at 240 feet a minute? If we slow down to min sync, we're going up. If we stay at max glide, we're going down. We're going down slowly, but we're going down. So the difference could be hours in flight time if you were right at that margin. But most of the time it doesn't matter. And I say in thermal lift, not in ridge lift, because if we're flying ridge and the ridge is anywhere near us, anywhere proximate, we don't want to take a chance on slowing down and stalling and hammering back downwind into that.
Yeah.
Not a good idea. Okay. So then, we're going to fly at trim speed, which we've talked about. I mean, that's most of our flying. Most of the time we're flying. And I've called it best L over D here, just so that you understand that lift to drag thing. But maybe it's getting almost time that we talk a little bit about the drag. So we will in a moment. What are we going to use 5 miles an hour faster than trim speed for, the D prime column?
Best glide.
Best glide in what situation?
Wind.
When there's a bit of wind, yeah. And as a good rule of thumb, I mean, here what we've said is, okay, 10 mile an hour wind, we're going to increase our speed by 5 miles an hour. We've lowered our angle of attack a little bit, and we've increased our speed from 24 to 29. So 5 miles an hour and a 10 mile an hour wind, just as a rule of thumb, maybe pull in an inch or two for every 10 miles an hour of wind. Of course, we're not going to be flying in more than 20 miles an hour wind, and it's exponential. So as you get it maybe in a 20 mile an hour wind, maybe you're going to pull in 4 or 5 inches. You're going to pull in a lot. And that's not only because of the control issues and stuff, it's to try to clear an obstacle. So let's look at a couple of situations in wind where we're going to clear obstacles and where we have this trade-off between angle of attack, airspeed, and lift and shape, and all this stuff, and marry it all to a situation. We're going to imagine that we're looking at the same diagram. We're coming in from, maybe a couple of 100 feet, and we're coming into a situation that's relatively common. We're coming into a restricted landing area. It's got trees at the upwind end, and we want to obviously land short of the trees. Maybe there's a pond back here, so we can't land too far back. So we're kind of lining up our landing here, all right? Now, we're flying at trim. I'm going to call it 25 miles an hour. AS, airspeed. In a 20 mile an hour headwind, GS, our ground speed is 5 miles an hour. So we're coming down, we're not flying very fast over the ground. So our glide path, it's not on our page, but it's going to be a very steep angle. Now, we hit what's called the wind shadow line, or the shear line. And underneath that shear line is a wind shadow. And a wind shadow is much like a sun shadow. If you've got something blocking the sun, you have shade. If you've got something blocking the wind, you have less wind. It makes sense. But what would happen when we hit this line? Well, the first thing is our ground speed is going to leap, because with only a 5 mile an hour wind speed down here at this line, suddenly we're going to have a 20 mile an hour ground speed. So suddenly the glider is going to increase. Now, in many aircraft books, they show the glider stalling at this point. And in a hang glider, especially if we were pulled in even just a tiny bit, it's so light it picks up the speed so quickly when the headwind's removed. So we aren't going to stall. But we are going to do is change our ground speed dramatically. So the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to start going faster over the ground. Now, we're ground creatures. What might you want to do if you suddenly feel your speed quadruple?
Get down quick.
Or might you want to be slowing down?
Yeah, exactly. Get down. Yeah.
Slow down. Bad idea. Bad idea. Okay? If anything, when you feel your ground speed increase, speed up a little bit. Because what does it mean? It means you've lost your headwind. Maybe you're in turbulence. Maybe a thermal broke off. Something like that. So we want to maintain our control near the ground. So if anything, we're going to take some speed. Slight problem, though. What's going to happen to our glide path?
It's going to increase.
It's going to be extended. Oh my gosh, we could fly right into the trees. So this is a situation that I talked about where maybe here you would want to slow down to 20 mile an hour, come back down here, and then dive in and land in that safe place. Right? That's one thing to do. Or just plan more ahead, realizing that this is going to happen. But let's suppose you plan poorly. You get into that situation. You're in the shadow. You're headed toward the trees. You've kept your speed. What are you going to do?
Stall.
Okay, one thing you could do is if you're going to hit the trees is you could stall. But here you're in a tailwind now. You've actually got a rotor there. So you're going to, even stalled, you're going to be hitting the trees at 20 miles an hour, which is more than a fast walk. So what's the other thing maybe you could do? Maybe right about here where you realize, you could turn. You could do a gentle turn, not too steep, and turn and land sideways. You don't have to be landing on the wind. There's almost no wind down here. In a 20 mile an hour wind, you wouldn't want to be landing sideways. But in a 5 or even a 0 mile an hour wind, you could do that. As you get the wing near the ground, a phenomenon called ground effect occurs. It happens with all aircraft. And basically, it happens even more with hang gliders because of our increased angle of attack. Close to the ground, anywhere, and when we're flying a glider, there is a situation that the glider has some billow. There's not very much billow in this, but remember that there's a high pressure beneath the wing. So that high pressure tends to leak out toward the sides of the glider, and there's a low pressure above the wing, so the air tends to curl in toward the center a little bit above the wing and flow out toward the wingtips below the wing. Now when it gets to the tips, you can see air going this way underneath, air going this way on top, so you get, and some aircraft will put a little dam there, higher speed aircraft, to try to block those vortices. But basically, those are called tip vortices. You don't need to know what they're called, but what that does is it is a form of induced drag. And I told you we'd start talking about drag. So induced drag is sort of the analogy of behind a transport truck. When you're behind a transport truck, there's a big rotor back there. That's a gross exaggeration of these tip vortices. But that rotor will actually suck along a car behind it. And you've seen geese flying staggered. So there are two wakes that happen on a hang glider. There's a wake behind. It's much like a boat. You've got the wake right in the center of the wing behind and a little bit below. So if you stay above behind a glider, you won't get waked. And then there's that second line. It's sort of like the wake that you jump when you're water skiing that goes out in an angle from the boat. So that happens on wings as well. And we can't really ride that wing from another glider. We don't have the sensitivity of birds. But birds do that. What does happen is as we get close to the ground, when we get the ground in here, the ground will block those vortices. And that induced drag that's holding back, like the transport truck is being held back. And you know, when you get in behind a transport truck, he might be annoyed at you because he can't see you. But you're actually helping him as well as he's helping you. He's helping you a lot more. You get a whole line of transport trucks, they help each other. So, when you block the induced drag, that's part of the thing that is your lift to drag coefficient. If you decrease the drag, you're going to extend the glide a little bit. So you actually glide close to the ground, you glide a little bit further. You need two things. You need the wings to be level. If your wings are not level, then that'll be spoiled. You're going to probably stall the tip because this tip, if you're turning, this tip comes into the ground, it reverses the flow, and it'll stall the tip. And that's one situation. And plus you've got gradient, so there's more wind on the upper wing than there is on the lower wing, and it'll tend to roll you around. The other thing is you've got to have sufficient airspeed. We've been talking about this again and again. Keep your airspeed near the ground. So with that airspeed, you get a blocking of induced drag, and you get a bit of cushioning. When we come into the ground, we come in at a higher angle of attack. So a lot more air comes into the front of the glider than gets out at the tail. So there's a little bit of compaction to increase the high pressure beneath the wing. So those two things combine to make you go further when you're close to the ground, which will make this situation, if you're trying to avoid an obstacle, even worse. So that might be a time when you have to stuff the glider. If you get down that close to the ground, you can't turn. But hopefully you adjust the situation by planning ahead or by turning at an appropriate time. There are two other kinds of drag. One is profile drag. Now, profile drag is the amount of drag that sort of your body gives. The glider's drag is fixed, but your body, you can change it dramatically. It's kind of like what the skier does. He reduces his profile drag when he tucks. That makes him go faster, less drag. So if you're upright in your harness and you've got your legs out of your, everything's all wide and big and draggy, then you're actually going to come down at a steeper angle. Then if you stay prone, and we'll come to a minute, there might be situations where you want to go a little further if you can. So you might want to stay, less profile drag by being, and that's also where the guys, have a nice slick, tight harness, so they don't have as big a profile to offer the wind. And the final variable in drag is parasitic. And parasitic drag is a lot more subtle, but it's that, like when you wear Lycra, it's very slippery. It's the air turbulating over what you're wearing and over the wing. So you'll see some gliders are made from Mylar now, have been for some time. And that's a slicker, so less parasitic drag, so it'll glide a little bit better. And if you wore, like the guys who wear those really sleek racing harnesses, they're going to wear a nice tight sleeve. The tight sleeve reduces the profile, and then they're going to wear like a Lycra, so it slips through the air even better. So those are drags. Now, it doesn't really matter an awful lot because you're not going to mess with this too much, except maybe if you were going to clear an obstacle. In the introduction, in your notebook, there's a little bit about this, but let's talk in more detail. We want to clear an obstacle. Let's say now we're coming into land and there's an obstacle at the downwind end of the field. And we're wondering, can we get over it into the field to land beyond it? Well, now's when we're going to play where these numbers start to matter. Because if you're able to get past that, routine. But if this is all trees, this side, or the ocean, or something nasty, cactus, you really want to get beyond it. So the idea is to plan your glide and make decisions early. Now, when you're close to the ground, and of course, if you're flying in a training situation, you're probably flying in an area where it's big enough, there's no obstacles anywhere. Anyway, but once you start to get high and you start coming in from altitude, you're going to be thinking about, okay, can I clear that obstacle? When you're close to the ground, you can use what's called the stationary point method. Maybe it's a fence. So you're trying to decide, well, should I land short of the fence or should I try to land on the other side of the fence? So what you could do is, if you're flying right at it, it won't move. That's called the stationary point technique of glide gauging. So you're flying right at that, it doesn't move. If you had a little bit of extra speed, then when you got to the obstacle, you could trade it for a little altitude, take your speed again, come in and land on the other side. But when you get really high, stationary point method doesn't work. When you're up at 1,000 feet and you're trying to decide, well, can I make it over that next mountain ridge to the valley beyond, or should I go the other way? Stationary point, I mean, you look down, nothing's moving. So then you can use what we call the gun sight technique. Now, the gun sight technique is where the idea of gun sight is that, okay, you've got this here, that's this is the ridge, and this is some trees in the valley. And what you can do is you can line the two of them up and then see if the angle changes. Now, if you're going to clear the ridge, then you're going to see more and more of the hindsight. I mean the foresight, okay? And less of the hindsight. If you're starting to get too low and you're not going to make it over the ridge, now this one's sticking up and you're losing that one. So those are two interesting techniques, because lots of people think, well, what if I don't have, if you have a GPS, now the modern GPS Varios have that all figured out. They'll tell you, do you have sufficient glide? But until you get that instrument on the board, you can use the instrument you've already got on board, your eyes and your mind. So those are good things to know about. Now we've seen about ground effect and how to avoid that situation near the ground, make it work for you rather than against you. If we increase the speed a little more, let's see if we can find a use for that. About the only time, if you look on the chart, column E, line 9, right in that last box, the only time you really need a dive is if you encounter extreme headwinds. Sometimes people wonder why we don't fly in more wind. And I mean, the gliders now, some of the top-end gliders will go 80 miles an hour. So why are we shutting down at 25 miles an hour? Do you know the answer to that?
For safety.
For safety, because of turbulence near the ground. The biggest problem with high winds is not the one listed here with penetration, but that could be a problem. It could be a situation, especially if you were on a mountain and you got blown back a little bit, and now you get into the Venturi and you're getting blown back further, you got the bar all the way in, and that's what you'd need it for, to get out of that situation. So you've got the bar right in. Hopefully you would penetrate out front and then not allow yourself to get back over the mountain again and get out of there and go down and land before the wind picks up anymore. The situation, if you aren't able to penetrate, you do not want to come down into that rotor. So what you would do is bail, go downwind. Your glide is going to be 80 to 1, something phenomenal. So you'll be able to go far enough downwind that you can find another safe place to land. Remember that if you're looking for a place to land, we talked about clearing an obstacle. While you've got altitude, it looks like it's dicey to get into that field. Maybe you just bail while you've got altitude and choose another field. And certainly the most common use of high speed is coming down if you get in that rare situation where you get too much lift. We spend all our time looking for lift, but the odd day can occur where the lift is really big and we start going up faster than we wish, and there's a big cloud above us. We're wondering, okay, how to get. Well, the first thing is, we covered this in the wind lecture, we try to penetrate and get sideways. If by pulling the bar to your knees, you're not getting out of there, you're still going up and you're not flying fast enough to get out of there, you're going to add a turn. our most rapid rate of descent is bar right in, all the way over. It's called a spiral dive. And generally speaking, you'll get an extra couple of 100 feet a minute by adding the turn. So that's the other use of a dive, is with a turn, spiral dive to try to get down if you got in too much lift. Much better to leave the lift before it gets above half that. Okay, so does it seem clear to you then, line 10, what's the most reliable mode to fly? Where are you going to do most of your flying?
In trim flight.
Trim
Max
flight,
glide.
D, max glide.
Mm.
Absolutely. It's a lot less work, you're effortless on the bar, and you just enjoy it way more. Okay, so I'm going to flip the page now, and we'll just look at this last chart. And this chart, again, was really kind of thrown in as a bonus just to help people select a glider. I think the most common error in judgment that occurs in selection of gliders is thinking, okay, I don't want to buy a glider, a beginner glider, and then I'm going to outgrow it in a few months, and then I'm going to have to buy an intermediate glider, and then I'm going to outgrow that in a few months, and then I'm going to buy another glider. I'm just going to go ahead and buy that blade wing, that hot ship, right off the top, and, you know, I'll just be careful flying it. The error in that thinking is exposed on this chart. You know, when you buy something that's beyond your level, the performance is of little value if you can't enjoy it. And the problem is that handling, ease of landing, those kinds of things are so important in the beginning stages. You don't want to have a bad experience when you're just beginning to fly. So you want to choose, if you look at the glider, you want a high reliability, a mellow glider.
It seems these days that aviation, there's no question it's a dangerous activity, but lots of people make it a lot more dangerous than it needs to be by making bad judgments. Pilots fly in conditions that are beyond their skill level. They fly in aircraft that are beyond their skill, or a combination of those coupled with plain bad judgment, flying in you know, bad weather.
Remember too that if you buy something that's expensive, maybe that's going to be a lot more enjoyable to fly than something that's older and less money. And it's not what you spend, it's what you spend compared to what you can sell it for if and when you move up. Some guys enjoy their beginner gliders so much that they keep them even when they get more advanced gliders, just because they're quicker to set up, they're lighter, they're so much lighter to fly, and you know, it's great for in certain areas where you don't care about how far you go, how fast you go. The sink rate's fantastic on these gliders.
I know ever since that accident, I've been much more conservative. I went from a DHV 2.3 wing to a DHV 1.2 wing. Now I'm shopping around for a DHV 1 wing.
You want to have something that has a good history and good handling and maneuverability, a nice light touch. That's what you're looking for in a glider. And the other thing I think that a lot of people make the mistake is that they think, okay, well, the most important thing is how much. And I think that we all make these mistakes. I don't know whether mistakes may be too strong a word, but we sometimes buy by price alone. I think it's a big problem in our society as a whole. It allows companies that are giant mega corporations to, you know, victimize third world countries in order to give us a better price. But it also means that if you buy a cut rate glider out of the internet and don't support your local dealer, what's going to happen down the road? There's going to be nobody to train those people like that. If a guy's teaching hang gliding, he needs your business. If he's taught you to fly, I think that, you know, you should at least give him a shot at getting you a glider that'll work for you. And you know, that's the kind of thing that this chart exposes. The wing is an interesting and informative lecture, I hope. I hope you learned a few things, and there's tons more information on the internet and in your textbook. Talk to your instructors, email us, whatever. The personal part is your decision about what wing to fly, and more importantly, coming up, when to fly. When are you a reliable pilot? Let's think about that now.